What's up guys, Brian here with BPS Customs. Today taking a look at the entry into the Ryzen 5 lineup that I find to be the most intriguing, the 1600. Now the Ryzen 5 1600 hasn't received the most fanfare because it's neither at the top of the stack nor the cheapest one of the bunch. However, it toes a fine line between price and performance that I think makes it the most appealing new offering from AMD. So in this video right up here, I took a close look at the top end of the Ryzen 7 stack, as well as the Ryzen 7 1700, the cheapest offering from the red team at the time. What made the 1700 the best value was not necessarily only that it was the cheapest, but that it was also still an 8-core 16-threaded CPU capable of the same heavy lifting as the 1800X, which costs significantly more. When we look at the Ryzen 5 lineup, it looks a bit different. The highest end model is the 1600X, a 6-core, 12-thread chip, but the bottom end of the range does not stay consistent with this core and thread count. Consequently, there is a significant drop-off from the 1600X to the 1400X as we go from 6 cores to 4. However, the sweet spot for price and performance likely lies somewhere in the middle with either the 4-core 1500X or the 6-core 1600, as the 1600 is likely to offer a decent performance boost at a price that's still lower than Intel's i5 lineup. I decided that this is where I would focus my testing. Now, when deciding what to test against and how to test, I figured the safest bet would be to try to compare the 1600 to the closest competitor from Intel in both price and configuration. This meant the 7600K for price and the 6800K for cores and threads. Unfortunately, I don't own a 6800K, but I do own a 6900K. By disabling two of the 6900K's cores and locking the clock speed to 3.6 GHz, we could approximate what a 6800K might look like without any overclocks applied. While admittedly this was not the most scientific way to complete these tests, it definitely gave me a reasonable facsimile of the 6800K's performance. I only included my build your own 6800K in 6 of the benchmarks where the CPU was being stressed in multi-threaded workloads just to get an idea of relative computational power versus the 1600. While I was at it, I also flashed the newest BIOS on my Asus Prime X370 Pro motherboard before testing my Ryzen 5 1600 and retesting my Ryzen 7 1700. Finally, I also reran all benchmarks on my i7 7700K, giving us a grand total of 5 different processors being run through the gauntlet. I tried to keep the testing environments as similar as possible by using the same kit of G.Skill DDR4 2400 when I could, and in the X99 setup I used a 4x4 gig kit of Corsair Vengeance LPX 2400. I was able to run the memory on all platforms at its rated speed without any issues. Some consideration was given to attempting the benchmarks using a higher speed memory configuration. However, I did have some concerns about achieving stable overclocks while maintaining 3000 or 3200 MHz on the DIMMs. As a result, I kept everything at 2400 to make sure the playing field was level. Yes, Ryzen does see some real benefits from faster RAM, but both Z270 and X99 do as well, and I felt it was more important to make sure my testing environment was static. All tests were run with a Founders Edition GTX 1080 at stock speeds. The Z270 tests were run on a Gigabyte Z270X Gaming K7, and the X99 tests on a Gigabyte X99 Ultra Gaming. Overclocking the 1600 was interesting, as I seem to have a decent amount of headroom here, much more so than with either of the Ryzen 7 chips I tested. I was able to push past 3.8 GHz and almost finish my benchmarks at 3.9 GHz before it crashed. I'm convinced 3.9 GHz is within reach. However, the best return I got was actually at 3.7 GHz, considering the voltage I had to apply to hit the higher frequencies, as well as the temperatures that had me a little nervous. 3.7 GHz got me within usually 1 or 2 percentage points of scores at 3.8 GHz, so I felt it wasn't worth it to try to push further. The rest of the overclocks were the same as I've previously tested, with the 1700 hitting 3.9, the 7600K hitting 4.5, and the 7700K sitting pretty at 5 GHz. Let's jump into the numbers. As with the Ryzen 7 lineup, we see single-threaded scores in Cinebench and Geekbench that reflect just how powerful the Intel chips are on an instructions per clock basis. This is the main reason that some games perform noticeably better on the Intel platform. When we switch over to multi-threaded versions of the same tests, however, we see that the 1600 beats not only the 7600K, but also the 7700K and our do-it-yourself 6800K. The 6800K did eke out an advantage at stock speeds in Geekbench, but remember that it's also about $200 more expensive. 7-zip also shows just how powerful having those extra threads is when number crunching, as the 1600 beats up on even the 7700K here. In my 4K export test, while the 1600 clearly beats out the 7700K, it ultimately loses out to all the other chips once we apply our overclocks. This was a bit unfortunate, as I was expecting big things from the 1600 given its advantage in core count over the 7700K. Moving on to some synthetic benchmarks, I found the Firestrike physics score to be quite telling, as they fell right in line with what we might expect. The 7600K struggled here given its lack of hyperthreading, while the 1600 put up numbers that were only beaten by the 1700. TimeSpy scores tell much the same story, with the 1600 beating up on all the 4 core parts, but losing out to the more expensive Ryzen 7 chip. Next up were two benchmarks from Unigine, the classic Heaven as well as the brand new Superposition. Heaven shows a clear bias for high IPC, as the Intel chips put up big numbers here. However, note the performance gains by the Ryzen chips when overclocked. Superposition scores across the board are fairly comparable, indicating that even at 1080p, the bottleneck in our system is still the GPU. I may try to rerun the test at a later time at a lower resolution to try to see if we could get some differentiation. And finally, we come to our suite of actual game engine benchmarks. All these tests were run at 1080p max settings to put the load on the CPU. We see small but significant deltas of about 5% between the 1600 and the 7600K in titles like The Division and Ashes of the Singularity. Scores between these two in Metro Last Light were almost identical, although we see the 7700K really pulling way ahead here. The spread was only about 2% in Doom, although we see that the Intel CPUs do hold a clear advantage here. Titanfall 2 sees this widen back up to about 5 to 6%, whether stock or overclocked. But when we come to our last test, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Ryzen really has some bad mojo going on, as we see almost a 30% jump in performance from the 1600 to the 7600K. This holds true for the 1700 as well, although the difference is narrowed slightly. So with all this data, what can we conclude? Well, as always, it comes down to your use case. If you have $220 to $240 to spend on a processor and need to choose between the 7600K and the 1600, only really you can know for sure what the most frequent task you'll be putting your machine through will be. If you're doing video editing on a budget with some light gaming on the side, the 1600 would be perfect for you. If the inverse is true, the 7600K holds the clear advantage. One more important thing to note though is that AMD is committed to the AM4 platform for a number of years, meaning that your motherboard, memory, and cooler will be compatible with upcoming generations of processors. This is not true for Intel, which usually has a 2-year cadence when it comes to replacing sockets. If rumors are to be believed, the LGA 1151 platform will actually be outdated as of June of this year. For those on a budget, this is something certainly worth considering. So that's all for this video, guys. Let me know down in the comments if you think the 1600 is right for you. Also, don't forget to get subscribed to the channel if you're not already, and hit that little like button down in the corner if you feel this video was just the tops. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you next time.